Hello, welcome to session 5 of Habakkuk, the foundation of faith. We're closing in on the final verses of this book. We have one short chapter left. Well, it isn't that short, but it's such a full, rich chapter. I'm sure it'll take us 2 weeks to get through, and I don't want to rush it because there's so much there. Before we begin, a quick recap of last week. Last week really was devoted to God assuring Habakkuk and us that he would take vengeance on the enemies of Israel. That even though he was using the cruelty of Babylon to punish his people, he was using it, governing it. He didn't create it, and he would punish it. He would take vengeance. Vengeance is mine, says the Lord, and I will repay. We find that in Deuteronomy 32:35 and Romans 12:19. But you know, there's a lovely little verse in Psalm 18, verse 47 that I'm going to read from the NLT. David says, "He is the God who pays back those who harm me." What do we learn from that? Well, we learn that we don't have to. That tendency to want to pay somebody back, to want to see them get theirs, it's really strong. But we're set free from that because that's a heavy burden to carry. God says, I'll take care of it. He doesn't say, it's okay, in my mushy kind of love, I'm going to forgive them anyway, so we're just all going to get along. That is not the God of the Bible. He says, I will repay. And he assures Habakkuk at great length all the different ways that he is going to punish and pay back the Babylonians for their cruelty against the Babylonians for their cruelty against his people. So that was last week. Now God is just finished giving this answer to Habakkuk. And Habakkuk's reply, his response, is in chapter 3. It's more like a prayer. He's talking to God, but it's what we call a prophetic prayer because God gives it to Habakkuk. He gives it to him in a series of dramatic and glorious visions that Habakkuk can both see and I think hear. I think there are sound effects. And it's just, it terrifies him, but it's exciting to him at the same time. And he's trying his best to write it down for us. It's one thing that's interesting to me here before we begin was that Habakkuk could have been done with God and God with Habakkuk. Habakkuk had 2 questions for God. He got into his face twice. He had something to say. He had something to ask. God answered in complete sentences. He gave Habakkuk complete answers to both questions. Habakkuk could have gotten up and said, thank you, I heard you, and gone his way. But he didn't. He was still waiting on the Lord, and the Lord had more for him. There's an interesting verse in Genesis, I think it's chapter 18, verse 33. And it says, and the Lord went his way as soon as he was done communing with Abraham. Another version says, Abraham went on his way as soon as the Lord was done communing with him. Either way, the idea is, let God decide when he's done. I thought of this when I read this last chapter. It just kind of dawned on me that God had more to say. And what if we had missed this wonderful chapter of glorious visions of God? When I have my devotions, see, even the vocabulary, when I have my devotions, when I do my devotions, it's something to check off my list for the day. I've read my Bible, I've said my prayers, up and at 'em. That's okay, But because even God told Hezekiah once, Hezekiah, get up off your knees, stop praying, and do it. Get busy. Sometimes that's appropriate. But the idea here is let God decide. Sometimes when I'm done, as it were, I just wait a while, and if I have the time to do so, and I say, Lord, do you have more for me today? And it's fascinating. Sometimes there's another Bible passage that he wants me to read, and there's something revealed in it. Or he gives me ideas for my life that I've been wondering about, some that I've never wondered about. Or an answer to prayer will kind of come surfacing to my mind. It's interesting, not always. The idea is let God decide when he's done with you, and then you will both get up and leave and go your ways for the day. it makes the devotional life much more interesting. Well, here we go. Habakkuk chapter 3. I'm going to read just 1 or 2 verses at a time and then try to explain the vision if I can. And I want to say a word about that as well. There are about 3 schools of thought out in commentary land on what all this means. One says that it's all in the future. It's visions of God going up against Babylon, and he's continuing to say how he's going to take vengeance on Babylon. And there's another school of thought that says God is giving Habakkuk a series of visions about all the ways that he has shown up when Israel has needed him in the past with power and with miracles. And that's the one I'm going with, because every time I read through this book, that's what my mind and my heart tell me. But if your Bible commentary tells you something else, don't worry about it. That's the nature of dreams and visions. God didn't give it to us with clear didactic explanations. He wants us to dig into it and see what we can learn from it, and learn and see God. That's the main thing, see God. And so I'll give you today what I have. Habakkuk chapter 3. A prayer of Habakkuk the prophet, according to Shigionoth. That's just a musical term. That means that when Habakkuk wrote this down, he put it to music. And the church used this, or the Israelites used this as part of their temple worship. They sang this. Habakkuk says, and remember, God gives him this. He says, "Oh Lord, I've heard you." Remember, God is just done speaking. Chapter 2 is just ended, and Habakkuk begins by saying, "Lord, I have heard you. I heard what you said. And your work, O Lord, do I fear. In the midst of the years, revive it. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy." He's saying, I hear you, God, when you say all these awesome and powerful and terrible things that you're going to do. I hear you. I get it. But he said, in the midst of the hard years that are coming, in the midst of the years of the Babylonian siege and the captivity that follow, in your anger with us, remember mercy. It doesn't say, remember we're your children and deserve better treatment. Now he says, be merciful. We don't deserve it, but have mercy on us. And, it's interesting. God did. He took care of them in Babylon very, very well. In fact, when it was time to leave after the captivity was over, some of them didn't want to leave. Both the miracle of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego saved in the fiery furnace. Remember that tremendous story in the book of Daniel? That took place during the captivity. Daniel in the lion's den took place during the captivity. So there are many instances where we read that God, in his anger with Israel, he remembered mercy. And then Habakkuk starts seeing these visions. And I think it flows out of his prayer in verse 2. Revive your work, do wonderful works for us. Have mercy on us. And then I think he's remembering God's mighty works. He starts in verse 3. He's seeing glorious, majestic visions and doing his best to write down what he sees. He says, God came from Teman and the Holy One from Mount Paran. Or he comes from. The verb there can be anything. Or he is coming from, he came from. His splendor covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. His brightness was like the light. Rays flashed from his hand, and there he veiled his power. I think that he's talking here about the giving of the 10 Commandments. He starts with that, and then you'll see as we go on, he mentions different occasions in Israel's history when they needed God, and God showed up in some powerful and mighty way. And I think we begin with the giving of the 10 Commandments. And the reason I think that is because the wording, when the 10 Commandments are given, and later when Moses is telling the people about them, is so much the same. It really is. I'm going to read Deuteronomy 33, 1 and 2. Moses is talking about the giving of the 10 Commandments. And he said, the Lord came from Sinai and dawned from Seir upon us. He shone forth from Mount Paran. He came from the 10,000s of holy ones with flaming fire in his right hand. So he says he came from Paran with flames of fire when he gave the 10 Commandments. And in Exodus 19, starting at verse 9 and 16, you should read the whole chapter. The Lord said to Moses, behold, I am coming to you in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with you, and may also believe you forever. And on the morning of the third day there were thunders and lightnings, and a thick cloud on the mountain, and a very loud trumpet blast, so that all the people in the camp trembled. And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And then he gives the 10 Commandments to his people. So I think that he's remembering. God has given him a vision of that day when God showed up in such power. And he veiled his power. Remember, he came in a thick cloud. He was covered with smoke. The people weren't allowed to come near, but there were flashes of lightning and brightness all around him. Then he says, before him, I'm in verse 5, before him went pestilence, and plague followed at his heels. This could mean two things or both. It could be talking about the plagues that God sent to Egypt when he delivered them from slavery. Remember the 10 plagues of Egypt? That's a powerful Bible passage. It could be all the times in the Bible where it says that God sent disease and pestilence on their enemies. One time he sent out hornets to drive the enemy away. You know, he had his ways. It's really very interesting. But what Habakkuk is seeing, something from the past, he's seeing God do this. Verse 6, he stood and measured the earth. He looked and shook the nations. Then the eternal mountains were scattered. The everlasting hills sank low. His are the everlasting ways, or were the everlasting ways. You know, again, I think he's talking about when he measured out land to each of the tribes of Israel. The Bible says in more than one place that he outlined carefully the boundaries for each tribe and assigned them their place. And you know, that wasn't that easy, though. The place was full of enemy peoples, but God said, this is for you. This is for you. It was all carefully measured by God. And I want to read an interesting verse in Deuteronomy 32, verse 8. It says, when the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. So in other words, when God decided in the whole world what nations would occupy what areas, he did it thinking what his people would need when their time on earth came. Isn't that interesting? He had his people in mind from the beginning of time. And even when he was apportioning out the earth, he was thinking, what will my people need when they come? It's just amazing. So Habakkuk is seeing in his vision God doing these things. You know, the everlasting hills sank low, eternal mountains were scattered. Psalm 68, 7 and 8 says that when God went before his people through the wilderness, that great earthquakes happened and mountains fell. Isn't that interesting? So I think he's just seeing that. God is showing him marching ahead of his people, causing mountains to get out of the way and the earth to quake, that his people can come through the land. And then his are the everlasting ways. You know, he's saying it was ever so. God, the all-powerful sovereign God, has always shown up for his people. The idea is he did it before, he can do it again. Then verse 7 says, I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction. The curtains of the land of Midian did tremble. You know, again, this is interesting because we can find this in the Old Testament pretty specifically. Judges chapter 6, 1 through 6. We're talking about how God shook the tents of the Midianites. I'm just going to read those verses for you. Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord gave them into the hand of Midian 7 years. And the hand of Midian overpowered Israel. And because of Midian, the people of Israel made for themselves the dens that are in the mountains, and the caves and the strongholds. For whenever the Israelites planted crops, the Midianites and the Amalekites and the people of the east would come up against them. They would encamp against them and devour the produce of the land, as far as Gaza, and leave no sustenance in Israel, and no sheep or ox or donkey. For they would come up with their livestock and their tents. They would come like locusts in number. Both they and their camels could not be counted, so that they laid waste the land as they came in. And Israel was brought very low because of Midian. Then it says, and the people of Israel cried out for help to the Lord. When the people of Israel cried out to the Lord on account of the Midianites, the Lord sent a prophet saying, basically, I'm going to deliver you from the Midianites. And to make a long and very interesting story short, I'm just going to read a verse from chapter 8 of Judges where Gideon is used against the Midianites. Verse 11 says, and Gideon went up by the way of the tent dwellers east of Nobah and Jogabah and attacked the Midian army, for the army felt secure. And Zebah and Zalmunna fled, and he pursued them and captured the 2 kings of Midian, and he threw the entire Midianite army into a great panic. There's a lot more to the story, but that's what Habakkuk is seeing. God is giving him this vision of what he did to make the tents of Midian tremble. And then in Numbers 31, there's another instance of Midian stirring up trouble for the Israelites, which they did repeatedly through a long period of time. And God finally, from time to time would just raise up and punish them for it. And Habakkuk is seeing these pictures. Another time is Numbers 31, 1 through 12. I'm not going to look that up, but you can read it if you're interested. It's the women, God says the women of Midian used their wiles to entice the Israelite men to serve Baal. And God wanted them punished for that. And so he did. He raised up someone to come and whip the Midianites for that. Also, it was the Midianites were involved in trying to get Balaam to prophesy against Israel and bring harm to Israel. And every once in a while, God would get fed up with Midian and fight against them and defeat them and make them shake in their boots. It's fascinating. It really is. And here's another instance. It says Cushan. He saw the tents of Cushan in affliction. Well, I'm going to read from Judges chapter 3, verses 7 through 10. It's about seeing the tents of Cushan in affliction. It says, the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and the Asheroth. Therefore, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he sold them into the hand of Cushan, the king of Mesopotamia. And the people of Israel served Cushan for 8 years. But when the people of Israel cried out to the Lord raised up a deliverer for the people of Israel who saved them, Othniel, Caleb's younger brother. The Spirit of the Lord was upon him, and he judged Israel. He went out to war, and the Lord gave Cushan, the king of Mesopotamia, into his hand, and his hand prevailed over Cushan. So these are just a couple, 2 or 3 instances from the past when God showed up against Midian and against Cushan. And Habakkuk is seeing these things reenacted in these visions. Then in verse 8 of Habakkuk chapter 3, it says, was your wrath against the rivers, O Lord? Was your anger against the rivers, or your indignation against the sea when you rode on your horses on your chariot of salvation? You stripped the sheath from your bow, calling for many arrows. You split the earth with rivers. The mountains saw you and writhed. The raging waters swept on. The deep gave forth its voice. It lifted its hands on high. This, I think, is talking about when God parted the Red Sea and the Jordan River so that his people could cross safely and be delivered. Here it says that at the end it's talking about was it the rivers you were mad at? Was it the sea you were mad at? And then it says that the sea and the rivers, they lifted their hands on high. Well, in Joshua 3:16, it tells us that when the waters of the Red Sea parted, when the waters of the Jordan parted, it said that the waters stood up in a heap on both sides. They raised themselves, they lifted their hands on high. You split the earth with rivers. Isaiah 43:19 says that God made a way in the desert for his people, that he made rivers where there were no rivers for them. It says that in Isaiah 43 verse 19, as well as other places. So I think Habakkuk is seeing all these mighty things that God did for his people in the past, and he's trying to tell us about it. I want to read to you Psalm 114, 1 through 8 in the NLT. God gave me these verses in my devotions just a short time ago, and it's talking about just that, about when God parted the Red Sea, and when mountains tumbled down, when earthquakes, when God led his people. And it's fascinating to me. I'm just going to read verses 1 through 8 of Psalm 114. When the Israelites escaped from Egypt, when the family of Jacob left that foreign land, the land of Judah became God's sanctuary and Israel became his kingdom. The Red Sea saw them coming and hurried out of the way. The water of the Jordan River turned away. The mountains skipped like rams. The hills were like lambs. What's wrong, Red Sea, that made you hurry out of their way? What happened, Jordan River, that you turned away? Why, mountains, did you skip like rams, and why hills like lambs? Tremble, O earth, at the presence of the Lord, at the presence of the God of Jacob. He turned the rock into a pool of water. Yes, a spring of water flowed from solid rock. This is almost exactly what Habakkuk is saying. He's seeing these same things happen, using slightly different terms, but not all that different. But what God spoke to my heart when I read this Psalm 114, I'd like to share with you. I had several worries that day, worries about my family, things that seemed impossible, prayer requests that just didn't seem possible. Worried about the church, same thing, problems that just didn't seem to have resolution. And I was just kind of upset and praying. And, God spoke to my heart when I read this psalm, and he said, you just walk with me. You have faith in me, live by my word. I'll walk you through. And when those moments come, I will part the waters. You don't have to know how I'm going to do it. Obstacles are just going to get out of the way at the right time if you're walking with me. They're just going to get out of the way. You don't have to know how I do it. And it spoke to my heart, and it gave me more peace than I'd felt in a long time. And that's what God is trying to do for Habakkuk. He's giving him these visions of God doing that in the past, showing up in a mighty way when his people needed him, so that Habakkuk can grow in faith during this difficult time. I think we're going to leave it there today. It's a good little break. We've got a couple of more things in the vision that we will look at next week, and then we have Habakkuk's lovely summary statements. So it was a little choppy and it was a little confusing maybe, but that's because there's so much here, and you can, if you're interested, you can go back at your leisure and look these verses up yourself. But I'm really quite convinced that's what was happening. He's saying, remember your mighty works of old, Lord, and do them again for us now during our captivity and during the war. And then he begins seeing all these things that God did for the people in the past with miracles when they really needed him and when they called on him. That's another important principle, call out to the Lord. Both times from Judges, when God came and fought for his people, it says they cry as soon as they cried out to him, even though they had been living in sin. The moment they cried out to God, God showed up. That's another thing that we can take to the bank and take into our own lives and our own situations. Just cry out to God when you need him, and he will show up. Well, there's a lot more to say, and I'm already looking forward to next week when we can read the rest of this wonderful vision that God gave Habakkuk, and then Habakkuk's mighty words of faith at the end. It has a profound effect on Habakkuk, changes his life forever, and I hope it'll change ours. So until next week, bye.